Hi guys, welcome to the third part of History Petrol Pace in order to help prepare you guys and enthuse you about your A-level study, which you'll be taking on in September. In the previous two, I've given you a little bit of an overview of the coursework aspect of the history course, which is the Russian story, which is in itself a fascinating and deep story. I was sort of struggling to think about the third one because I could continue with the Russia stuff, or I could in fact explore the German history. But at the end, I decided that what I want to talk you through is the British component of your A level, which is the Wars of the Roses, which is what we call the depth study. So the idea is the Russia and the Germany stuff are quite wide. They cover a long period of time, and examiners are looking to pick up more on the idea that you see how things change over time. Like with Germany, many of you have studied kind of the little bit of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler, but that's a very small snapshot. It's a much wider idea. However, with the Wars of the Roses, it's what they call a depth study. And you study it for 2 years and you have one paper, which makes up 40% of your total A level at the end of it in June. Now, the reason I wanted to pick the Wars of the Roses is I think it's one of those ones that many of you are probably less familiar with. It's also the kind of things you get as a history teacher where people say, well, this is all old stuff. Why do I need to know this? And I know that because I was that person. Once upon a time, I went up to college open day and I went to university open day 2 years later. And I remember my stupid 16, 18, 19-year-old self that I judge as stupid now. I think I remember saying to one of the history teachers, yeah, but isn't medieval history just like one king after another and nothing really happens? Because at the time, my interest and passion was modern history, particularly Russian history, actually, ironically. Boy, could I not be more wrong. And I can say that from a perspective being a little bit older now. Medieval history is fascinating in its own right. All history is history. And one thing that is particularly, I think, enjoyable about medieval history, certainly at the kind of level you guys are going to study at it, is it's so personal. It's a world where before we had all of the record keeping devices of modern society, most of its history is told from the perspective of the people at the top. Now, there are arguments in history about this is the right thing to do or wrong thing. But fundamentally, most of our sources, that's what we write history from, talk about the kings and noblemen and noble women and queens of the time and how they interacted, which means that the way the story is actually told is a little bit like a TV series or a film, where by definition, you can't focus in on the lives of everybody. If you think of every World War II drama you've seen in whatever format, it's not telling the story of the whole of World War II. It tends to focus in on individuals and their relationships and so on. And that's why the Wars of the Roses, I think, can really work, not just in terms of teaching history, but also in terms of enthusing you towards a topic. You've got to look at this like a narrative with a cast of people. And that's my idea today, to try and introduce you guys to the narrative. Just flip onto the next slide here. So less like the Russia stuff, and some of you may be doing some of the politics stuff with me as well, because that's my other subject that I teach. This is less about an investigation into learning lots of stuff and getting terminology and names. It's more a task or a set of tasks designed to wrap you up in the story of the Wars of the Roses. And if you approach it like that, as a story is getting to know the characters and the events, the analytical stuff will follow. The biggest struggle we find from students on this module is they just don't learn it well enough, what happened and when it happened. So that's what I'm going to try and introduce you today. Now, I'm going to make an argument that the Wars of the Roses is fascinating because historically it has become the origin story of England. Lots of countries and nations have their origin stories. For example, in my politics pace, one reason I was talking about how the American Revolutionary War, redcoats, George Washington crossing the Delaware, the US Constitution, people with white wigs on, is America's origin story. And you see people arguing about that today in the world by tearing down varying statues and putting other statues up and arguing these people should be more important or less important. Origin stories matter. They matter because they feed into a sense of the culture of that state, that country today, who you are and what you stand for. And if the Americans have the American Revolutionary War and the Germans have a very complicated origin story involving, Bismarck and the Nazis and the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and France, of course, has the French Revolution and the French kings, and Italy has the Renaissance, and I could go on and on and on. But we have define our status of who we are today by the stories we tell about our past. And the Wars of the Roses, for both deliberate reasons and undeliberate reasons, is England's. Specifically England's here, not so much Britain's, England's. And I'm going to tell you why. Who is this? I would imagine that the majority of you could answer that question. I'd imagine also, I'm going to get rid of this a minute. I'd imagine also that many of you are not so keen on him through having been either traumatized or infused by having to study at least one of his plays over the course of your English literature GCSE. It is, of course, William Shakespeare. Now, many of you might know him. I don't know what plays you guys generally did at school, but I would speculate Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth, some of his most famous plays, the ones you looked at. But Shakespeare was writing his plays around 1600, the end of the Tudor era, beginning of the Stuart era. So to him, the Wars of the Roses, or the period we call the Wars of the Roses, was a bit like World War I and World War II are to you. It was before his time, but it was the most important event in history to him. You think about the Second World War still dominates the UK today. It still dominates Europe and the world. It's still kind of like the last big thing that happened. And the world that we live in was formed from it. Like the worst thing you can call someone on the internet is a Nazi, as people are doing all the times over. That's because the Nazis were the bad guys in that story. It's the framework for the world we understand today. To William Shakespeare, this was the Wars of the Roses. His World War II was the Wars of the Roses. And Shakespeare made a lot of his name writing what he called his famous plays called Shakespeare's Histories, and they're the ones with all the king names in them: Henry VI Part 1 and Part 2, Richard III, and those kinds of things there. So the interesting thing is Shakespeare's version, because of who Shakespeare is and the way he's been taught in schools now for centuries and across our culture and his cultural significance, Shakespeare's version of the Wars of the Roses is probably more famous and more well known than what actually happened. That's a really important idea I want you to get there. The fiction of the Wars of the Roses is actually more famous than the actual events. And to an extent, that's what you do in this module. We go round the fiction to pick it up. Now, let's explore a little bit why this might have happened. Who are these monarchs? So here on the right-hand side, these monarchs are what we collectively call the Tudors. And I don't know if you guys have studied it before, but I'm sure at some point in your schooling, even if it was back in primary school, people taught you a little bit about the Tudor kings and queens. And they are certainly, perhaps one of the most famous kings in Tudor history, or in English history, Henry VIII. Not necessarily a good king, but a famous one. His father, Henry VII, who we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. Edward VI, the boy king. Queen Mary, or sometimes called Bloody Mary because of her Catholicism and so on. Again, a very interesting story, both from a gendered and religious perspective. And perhaps, again, maybe the most famous of all the Tudor monarchs, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. They are the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty are the single greatest proponents of political propaganda and spin in English history. There's a reason why you probably recognize the word Tudor more than you recognize the word Plantagenet or Hanoverian or Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which are other names of famous dynasties. It's because they were brilliant propagandists. They were brilliant at telling their own story. And it had been dramatized. This was a TV series that was made around the time that you guys were very small children, I think, the early to mid 2000s, called The Tudors, which is, I think is his name, Jonathan Rhys-Ifans. That's the name of the actor there. John and Natalie Dormer, who's another famous actress here, playing Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and all their stories there. Now, you ask, why am I talking about the Tudors when we're talking about the Wars of the Roses? Well, the reason is, fundamentally, that the Tudors weren't meant to be the monarchs of England. Simply, they weren't the kings. But through all of the strange stuff that happened in this 30 to 40 year period, this guy here, Henry Tudor, known as Henry VII, recent biography was written by him by a guy called, I think it's Thomas Penn, called The Winter King. Henry Tudor ended up as king, and he managed to keep the throne. The problem was he wasn't meant to be king, really. So he focused on retelling the whole story of the Wars of the Roses to justify why he was king and why his dynasty should rule England. And Shakespeare writing these plays 100 years later is part of that. It's not as simple as just, like he was a bit like Hitler or something and he retold history. It was more like a subtle weaving of narrative threads to make what happened be the true version of what happened. And good rulers understand that the story of your legitimacy, the story of your origins is really important to whether you be respected. And perhaps the best symbol of this was this symbol that he used to denote his monarchy. And this is called the Tudor rose. That's one there. So the idea is the Tudors became the monarchs of England, and then they twisted history to fit the story to say why they should have been the monarchs. And because of what happened afterwards, English historians, English storytellers, in fact, the entire English world has developed this narrative, this story of this is where England, the British Empire, good or bad, World War II, the Victorians, everything was born from this origin story. The Wars of the Roses is the origin story for what will become of England, from what England will go on to be. For those who are particularly interested in philosophy of history, that's what some people call the Whig school of history with an H in it. This idea of progress towards a goal, and then to know why you ended up being, in inverted commas, a great nation, you have to know what your origins are. That's what the Wars of the Roses is. So the Tudor Rose. I've done it with images here, but the way the story has become told, the way that Shakespeare wrote it, is the idea that England became divided between two noble houses. That means two highborn people of these old warrior knights like you see here. There was a king called Edward III. I think my internet might just have cut. I'm back, so apologies if there was a cut or a break in that. So there was a king called Edward III, who he claimed to be king of England and France. And he fought the French for a long time. That's all the story of Joan of Arc and everything. But fundamentally, the English lost. Edward III had many children. And in the end, the line of his eldest son, called the Black Prince, died out or was removed, depending on your interpretation. What it meant is his great-grandchildren were arguing with each other over who should be the monarch. And so these different houses, as they were called, were divided up into, and they were named after the title that the leader of that house had. And at the time of the Wars of the Roses, history has simplified this into saying that there were two houses. The house of the Duke of Lancaster, often shown with red and a red rose, which is anyone called Henry, basically. And the house of the Duke of York, which was Richard, and his son Edward and Richard III. And the idea was that these two dynasties divided England down the middle, into which the nobility and people of England stratified themselves into red or white, and they fought a serious number of conflicts. And in the end, the red side won, the House of Lancaster, which Henry Tudor claims to be from. Some of you might know a bit about football, and you come on this. You notice that Manchester United and Manchester City both use this symbol, this red rose, the redness of it. If you look at Manchester City's football badge, it has a little red rose on it because, for those of you who don't know, Manchester is in Lancashire. You might also know that Leeds United wear white and have in the past used this white and yellow symbol as their symbolism. If you're into cricket, you'd notice that Lancashire wear red and Yorkshire wear white and blue. And actually, if you start to see it, you'll see this division of these colours in a lot of things in England, particularly up there. The irony being that really the House of Lancaster doesn't have anything particularly to do with Lancashire, and the House of York doesn't have anything particularly to do with Yorkshire. But I will explain that to you on your course at a later point. Now, the thing I'm trying to say here is this narrative of a kingdom divided between two warring factions and eventually one triumphing and united the kingdom is pretty much fiction. It just wasn't that way. It's not as simple as that. It's a story that's been told later to simplify it into a way that makes sense for the story of Britain, the origin story. It is true that there was conflict between noble houses. It is true that there were battles, including the bloodiest battle in English history that you probably haven't heard of, called the Battle of Towton. It is true that Henry Tudor symbolized his reign by taking his red rose for Lancashire and marrying this person over here, played by Jodie Comer there, called Elizabeth of York, who was a daughter of the Dukes of York. So by marrying, he symbolized their union, and he placed the red rose and the white rose together to get the Tudor rose, a symbol of unity. But the narrative is completely different. Now, I just argued that the story is great because there are so many great characters in it. It's like an ensemble cast. That's where I'd put it. If you make it as a TV series or like the Avengers films again and so on, they are ensemble cast. They have more important cast members. I mean, I genuinely haven't seen it, but I'm pretty aware that I think Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man is the main guy in the Avengers, along with Captain America. And there are more who are lesser important. And that's the way you can look at it, learning who these figures are and how they interact. It's been turned, it makes for great TV and great storytelling, which is it's been told time and time again over the last 5 centuries. Recent examples would be The White Princess and The White Queen, which were books written by Philippa Gregory that have been adapted by TV. And as you can see, there's Jodie Comer, who played Elizabeth of York, the White Princess. You can watch that. It's been dramatized by Shakespeare. The BBC's recorded doing their plays there. These are this idea there of the Wars of the Roses. And it's also been taken as source material by other writers. Virtually every medieval style story that's been told in some form of English setting has borrowed from the Wars of the Roses in some way. Perhaps the most famous of all, though you guys are a little bit young, but your parents, you could certainly ask them, was the Game of Thrones series that was written by George Martin and was turned into a TV series. Granted, that also had dragons and ice zombies in it, but it still had this rough idea. And notice the colouring here of the Starks, led by Sean Bean at first, and the Lannisters, led by Charles Dance and Cersei Lannister here. Notice the colours. See? The red gold of the Southerners and then the harsh northern ones there. So it's all part of that story. And it's because it makes a good story. But more importantly, why study it? Because you get to do this thing where you can interact the idea of the story versus the history. It's good TV. It's an interesting story. Hopefully, as fully fledged growing into young adulthood people, you will relate to their stories. You're going to hear stories of teenage boys who feel under pressure to achieve, to live up to what their family expects of them. You'll hear stories of teenage girls pressured by the society they live in order to conform to their gender role, and yet many of them resisting this. Perhaps Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of England at the start, is a classic example. She's 15 years old when she's married to a husband who is incompetent, out of her own country. She's French, and over the course of her life, she seizes control of government and rules where her incompetent husband cannot. But this places her into conflict with other figures. This is what I mean. These people may be 700 years ago, or 600 years ago. They may be monarchs and rulers and lords and ladies. They may speak a language you don't recognize. They may believe in things you don't believe in. But they're still human, as are you. And when you study their motivations, hopefully you'll build this empathetic connection to understand why they feel and why they do what they do and the way that they react to different scenarios. And in addition to that, you'll watch them grow over their lives. Margaret of Anjou's story, spoilers, is rather sad. She becomes a princess of England at 15. By 20, it's clear that she is one of the most important people ruling England, but she's not allowed to say it because she's a woman. Margaret of Anjou will have a son when she's 23, 24. That son may or may not be her husband's. It's difficult to decide, but a lot of people reckon it wasn't her husband's because he probably wasn't capable of having children. So she probably had to have an affair to have that child, which placed her at risk of treason. She is thrown off the throne, put back on the throne through her rivalry with the Duke of York, and eventually she'll go into exile, raise her only son in exile for 10 years, and then she has to risk her son's life in a battle to win back her son's throne, and her son loses and is killed. So you will watch Margaret's story from being a 15-year-old, so the same age as you guys pretty much, through to a 40-year-old woman who loses everything. And whether she is a good person or a bad person, you guys will probably argue about this. And that's why it's important. It helps us understand people, even if they are queens and monarchs. So that's my sell for the Wars of the Roses. Now, I'm not going to talk you through all the narrative and the events. As we say, it's a depth study. You're going to study over 2 years. It would take me the best part of a week just to talk through it, let alone to get into analysis and evaluation. However, there is this guy, Dan Jones, is a let me correct my spelling. Apologies. Very important. There's a hit documentary series on YouTube called the Bloody Crown, which was on Channel 5 originally. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it divides some of the events of the Wars of the Roses up into kind of 45-minute documentaries you can have a look at. So, for example, here I've got the fourth one up here, which you can link through and hyperlink and watch. So I'd say watch those. Get a feel for the characters and what they're doing. Each one of those is 45 minutes, so it will take you, let me do my maths, 3 hours and 4, no. Yeah, I'm not having a good day that way. Less than 4 hours. Yeah, take you 3 hours. 3 hours to watch all of those. I don't really need you to worry about memorizing everything. I want you to get a feel for the story and the narrative. But more than that, I'd also like you to really, I'm sure that all of you enjoy fiction and storytelling in some way. To an extent, you wouldn't be history students if you didn't. You might enjoy different stories and different perspectives and different angles, but you do like narratives and stories, even if they're modern TV series. So the other thing I'd say to do is to try and then go and watch either stuff directly about the Wars of the Roses or stuff that draws inspiration from it. So, for example, Philippa Gregory is an author. She's written a whole series of books about this, and this is fiction. It's historical fiction. It's not history, though she has written a history book. She's made some rather contentious claims, by the way, as well, that historians would argue with. But a few of her books were kind of dramatized into 2 series. They had The White Queen, which is a BBC one, but you can get it on Amazon. You get it loads of places. I'm sure you can find it, which is about Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV. And The White Princess, which is about her daughter I mentioned earlier, up here, played by Jodie Comer, which is about Elizabeth of York. Con Eagledon has written a series of books about this. Again, he writes historical fiction. If you like reading, you like stories, go and have a look at historical fiction. Game of Thrones. Now, you guys may not be old enough for this. This is what I'm saying. Check with your parents before you do this. But Game of Thrones is not an allegory of the Wars of the Roses. It's not a direct retelling of the story, but in some ways, it's a wonderful reflection and capture of some of the ideas that drove those societies. It's adult in theme and adult in nature, so you need to check with your parents that that's appropriate for you to watch. But Game of Thrones, if that's okay, and you watch ones with the appropriate certificates, can give you a feel for it and hopefully invest you in that kind of period. If you're more literary minded and you really like literature and so on, and you liked Shakespeare rather than disliked it, you could check out his plays. And many of these have been recorded and dramatized on TV with a number of famous actors. For example, the BBC did a series called The Hollow Crown, where they replayed it all, and you had Benedict Cumberbatch as Richard III and so on, and that kind of things. So that's the goal. Spend time investing in the Wars of the Roses. Immerse yourself in it, learn the stories, and hopefully it will resonate with you. To an extent, history is easier to teach and to learn when it's brought to life, when you're invested in it. When you read about Margaret of Anjou's life, do you genuinely sympathize with her? A thing I've noticed is interesting from teaching this module to people from 16 years old to 50, because I teach adults as well, of all kinds of different family backgrounds, is how they all latch onto certain characters and how there are people they like more than less. For example, many of my female students seem to empathize greatly with the character called Elizabeth Woodville. That's the White Queen I'll tell you about. Because there are reasons. It appeals to the story, but they empathize with Elizabeth Woodville. And what you notice is they feel, to an extent, the things that happened to her in her life. Some of my male students, I mean, there was one guy I taught, he was fantastic at history. And he was 50. He'd, been a soldier and everything before in his life. He naturally gravitated towards the character of Edward IV, Edward Earl of March. There was something about Edward IV that appealed to him, that it resonated with his life story. And you could tell that whilst he wrote great history, he actually cared about this guy, Edward. And I think there's a character in there for all of you. There's a character for whatever you feel about the world, about what you want to be and what you want to do, that represents someone that felt in some ways the same way as you 6 centuries ago. And you can learn from that. You can learn from the things they've done in order to be able to live your life better than they did. That doesn't apply just to the Wars of the Roses. I think it just works well with the Wars of the Roses. So that's what I want you to do. Try and infuse yourself and develop a passion for this topic. Trust me, if you just put the time in, it will work brilliantly for you. And because you engage with it and learn to love the topic and the idea, you will do better at your A levels if you do that. Cool. Thank you very much, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you in September for A level history, where our first topic will be 1450 and the start of the Wars of the Roses. I'll see you all then.